As someone who studies history, what were some moments for you that you think will be remembered over time from this debate? Because a lot of it does tend to kind of die off after a few days.
Well, it does. I think, and it might die off. Every event these days moves very fast, and our attention doesn't really hold. But I think for those who remember it and think about it, one of the most striking parts in terms of how debates happen and how historically they've been used is Vice President Harris, I think, using the visuals of her on the split screen when she wasn't speaking to actually send messages to the electorate about what she thought of what the former president was saying, and almost to guide the viewer in terms of how they should think about what they were hearing. I thought that was pretty innovative. Usually the split screen is just someone standing there, and she used it to her advantage. And the second part, usually remember debates for things that go wrong. Occasionally there's a quip that someone makes that's effective. There you go again, for example. That's what Reagan said to Carter in 1980. But usually it's when someone makes a mistake. And I think this will be remembered for a very successful debate performance. She understood the art of debating, and throughout, she was just very skillful. There's not many examples I can think of in presidential debates where that's the takeaway.
And then one of the things that people were definitely talking about was that, as well as the fact that this debate kind of had a less of a policy energy to it. I know debates, presidential debates in particular, don't tend to revolve around policy often because it is about those quips. But is this a debate that had less policy than previous debates may have?
I think that's kind of a myth that people are talking about a lot, an expectation that's not realistic. I have seen debates for decades, and always the complaint is they're light on substance. And when policies discussed in 90 minutes, it's usually fast and fleeting, and the candidates don't get into really much detail. It's just not what these debates are about. So I think it's not unreasonable, but it's not what these are. And I think since they've really gotten going in 1960s, our first one with Kennedy and Nixon, and then in 1976 they start up again and become a permanent part of politics. Debate is only touched on. I think it's much more about how a person performs in a high stakes moment. That's what's being evaluated. What does a person look like in terms of, do they look presidential? Do they act presidential? What's their demeanor? And how do they handle confrontation, which is obviously part of what a president does. And I think that's what they've been about. And so when I hear that about Harris or the debates in general, that this one was light on substance, some of that was with the Biden one as well. I think it's just not what these are. Again, that might be bad, but it's not what the debates are.
And then, of course, younger audiences. Is this debate really that big a deal for younger voters?
Well, it's a big deal for voters. I can't remember the numbers. It's over 60 million people watched, and there's not a lot of high stakes moments in campaigns like this where so many people are watching. So, putting aside younger voters for a second, I still think it's important. We live in an age of fragmented media. Everyone's watching their own thing. People are watching on their phones, on their computers, on everything. And this is an exception. We all tune in, and it's timed. There's a convention and a debate, at least one, leading into the election. There's not a lot of opportunities to speak to that broad of an audience. That said, it is harder traditionally to engage younger people. I don't know what the ratings will be for younger people, but I do think you're right. There will be consumption of what happened through social media. So they'll get bits and pieces on TikTok, they'll get commentary on different sites. And I don't think that's irrelevant. It requires both campaigns then, though, to continue with outreach, mobilization, canvassing. It's not as if this will be enough to overcome a traditional amount of kind of lukewarm engagement by younger voters 18 to 29.
And I would also think that it makes for some conversations behind the scenes about quips that can be used as memes. But one other thing I wanted to touch on, though, was the fact that this race is also so tight. And it seems like after the Biden and Trump debate, there didn't seem to be that much of a difference in how Americans felt. We still have a lot of people that are undecided. And so, would another debate really make a difference?
Uh, Not necessarily in terms of shifts in the electorate, and it's not something that happens. We have this very polarized electorate, a 50-50 nation, and nothing really changes that. I mean, I think we see over and over, whether it was a pandemic in 2020 or presidential debates, things seem to stay about where they are. The only exception in some ways was President Biden, meaning his campaign had really deflated the natural 50 that the Democrats had, and she's gotten it right back to normal. A second debate, I suspect, wouldn't totally change that, but it could do two things. One is, like this debate, you're thinking of slivers of the electorate, not huge changes, but in these swing states, within the swing states, narrow portions, can you move enough voters, which is sufficient sometimes to win a state? And that's where a debate and a second one could certainly be impactful. And second, these debates are not simply about moving votes from one column to the other or even energizing voters. It's about telling a story about the candidate that culminates when a person makes their decision at the ballot. And that's where a second debate can be very important. I think a lot of people around former President Trump feel this was incredibly damaging to him because he showed a story, told a story about him as someone who's angry, who's somewhat unstable and is talking about conspiracy. And she told a story about someone who's ready to be president. And I think that will matter ultimately as people cast their votes.
And then the one thing that we also have to think about is the fact that the Electoral College is the big decider here at the end of the day. And we do notice that there are some states that are really in play here this election. Ohio's not one of them. We're really talking just north of the border in Michigan. And I find Michigan to be interesting here because it's a state that has a lot of Democratic leadership, but also does have a lot of conservative support too. So, what exactly does the message have to be for Michiganders?
Yeah, I mean, all the swing states, I think you just described pretty well. Some, unlike Michigan, have heavier conservative elected officials, but they have these big pockets of Democratic voters like Georgia. Some are thinking maybe North Carolina. Michigan's a little bit flipped. Look, that's where you're playing to parts of the state. It's kind of interesting. You're not trying to win Michigan. And I don't think Democrats, for example, are really thinking they're going to go into the rural areas of Michigan and all of a sudden find overwhelming amounts of support. What you're doing there is trying to galvanize the same voters who put a Governor Whitmer in office. You're going into a state like Georgia and you're trying to energize for example, Black voters who can make a huge difference, even if they're not a majority of the electorate, and swinging it as the state swung in 2020. So I think that's how both campaigns, frankly, are thinking of this. They're not turning that divided state map. They're just trying to elevate the vote of the people who are on their side, ultimately to get those electoral college votes.
And then finally here, I know that these campaigns, they have their own people, they have their own polls, they're making their own decisions. But I want you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of both of these campaigns here. In the next 2 months, what will each campaign have to do if they want success in November, in your eyes?
Well, I think for Republicans, it's continuing, and this is true for both parties, to just have a really effective canvassing and registration program. This is not the stuff of television and not necessarily the most exciting thing, but making calls in all the different ways we do it and sending out the text and setting up tables in communities, that's going to be hugely important. Face-to-face communication with voters is still by far the most effective way to increase the odds that they are going to vote. So I think for both parties, that's actually true. I think for Republicans, the biggest challenge in some ways is containing their candidate, meaning he does not listen to the consultants. He doesn't listen to the people surrounding him. So the risk is he does something, I'd say something like he did in the debate, that just undermines his own cause. And so they have to figure out how to direct him in the right way. That doesn't mean moderating. He won't do that. And I'm not sure that's the best bet, but at least containing kind of the most harmful elements of his politics. For Harris, I think, frankly, it's doing more of the same. I think it's a newer campaign. She does have to keep introducing herself to voters. I think she has to also try to show voters why questions of temperament and certain issues like reproductive rights, which don't poll as much as immigration and the economy, should be just as important. I don't think she's going to transform how people think of the economy or her on that issue. But if she can get their attention to those other two questions, she could be on her way to the White House. And I think for that campaign, that's what they're going to do.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there. You definitely have heard Democrats talk about those latter two issues rather than the economy. And I think it does kind of reflect in polls too, because it's the economy. It will always be, I think, for sure. And I appreciate you joining me to talk about all the craziness that we're going to experience in the next couple months.
Thanks for having me.